Well, congratulations to everybody. We have closed the doors. You packed out the house, so we're excited about that. So we're going to start just a little bit early here. And the first thing we do is pass around our little sign-in sheet, and that lets us know you're here. But also, if you aren't on our emailing list yet, you can put that on here too. So I'm going to start that, and we'll want to go back and forth along the rows and work our way to the back. So let's start with that. I'm Don Trosper with the Olympia Tumwater Foundation, and welcome to Schmidt House. 1904 house, added on to in 1910, and we're in the 1910 part of it. So everything's over 100 years old except for me. Exits, we have the double door exits here, the door you came in, and then there's an exit over by the kitchen in case something you need to run out of here for some reason. And then also in restrooms. There's 8 restrooms in this house, but only 1 on this floor. Can you believe it? And that's the one under the stairway, kind of a Harry Potter bathroom under the stairs. And but we do have a second floor, more bathrooms if you need to rest. So anyway, that's available to you. Want to thank TC Media for videotaping all these programs, and they end up on YouTube eventually, the Tumwater's YouTube channel, and then also it's on channel 26, Comcast, and so in about 2 to 3 weeks this will be aired on that. We need to, these modern times, please silence or put on vibrate at least your cell phones. The Schmidt family never had cell phones, but I bet Peter Schmidt would have improved on it because he was a techie guy anyway. So, all right, so once we've got that, I think we're ready to get started here. We're excited. I'm going to keep this short because we have a lot to cover here. Normally, I'd introduce a guest speaker to our History Talk series, but in this case, I have the privilege and the joy of introducing a member of our staff. And I'm referring to our assistant curator here at the Schmidt House, Megan Ockerman. We first met Megan when she began making use of our archives collection as an independent researcher for her master's thesis at the Washington State University in Pullman. And her finished product provides an in-depth look at the history of the Olympia Brewing Company and the famous beer, and of course the Schmidt family, whose impact continues to affect our region through the Olympia Tumwater Foundation. She earned her Master of Arts degree in 2017, so not too long ago, and she has so impressed us that we brought her on staff. We just thought that was great. And we're all proud of her and hope to see that the thesis will become a published book in the future. That's one of her goals, and I think you'll agree that's worth the effort, worth pursuing that once you hear what she has to present here today. So let's welcome Olympia native, WSU graduate, and our very own Megan Ockerman.
Thank you, Don. And thank you, everybody, for coming on what is becoming a very beautiful day. So before I began, I kind of wanted to take a poll of who here either worked at the brewery or had a family member, relative, in-law, teacher, neighbor, or otherwise somebody related to the brewery, and you feel like you have some direct personal connection to the brewery. That is what I suspected. So I thought that because I was expecting this, that I'm going to be focusing a little bit more heavily on the earliest history of the brewery, stuff that you guys won't remember, nobody living will remember. I'm going to cover pretty much everything, but I did want to focus more heavily on the old stuff. So our story begins in January 1846 in a very small town about an hour and a half northwest of Frankfurt in Germany, and that's where Leopold Schmidt was born. And Leopold is the young man in the middle in the back leaning on a chair. And he was born, he was the oldest son of 7 siblings, and he's pictured here with his parents and a brother-in-law. And we know very little about Leopold's youth, his young life. We know that his father, Wilhelm, was a mining engineer, and he was politically active enough that in 1848, when there are political revolutions all over Europe and in Germany, that he flees to the United States, and he's in exile in Missouri for a couple years. But up until Leopold's teenage years, that's really all we know about his home life and his childhood. But in 1860, when he's 14, he enrolls in seaman school in Hamburg. He becomes a sailor when he's only 14, 15. And when he graduates, he sails all over Europe, the Baltic, Mediterranean, and eventually all over the world. And it's going to become obvious fairly quickly that Leopold throws himself into everything he does. He doesn't just learn something, kind of tinker around. He becomes a master at everything he does. And the first thing of that is, of course, becoming a sailor. So in 1866, he's aboard a ship and he's sailing around Hudson Bay and the Great Lakes region in the spring. And shipping slows down in the fall and in the winter. So he decided to stay in the U.S. to hone his English language skills. And he decided to go to Missouri. So we're not entirely sure if the people that fled with his father were extended family or family friends, but they stayed in America when his dad went back to Germany. So he had sort of a safety net already in the U.S. He went down to Missouri, and come spring, he decided he was not going to go back on ships. He was going to stay in the U.S. And then he learns to become a carpenter. He just decided that he would do something else. So he learned carpentry, and he became very good at that. In fact, he worked for the man, if any of you have heard of Meerschaum Pipes, they made corncob pipes. It was the first company to ever make corncob pipes, because if you just hollow out a corncob and light it on fire, it does not end well. So there was a whole company that figured out how to be able to do that, and Leopold worked for that man because he's the Forrest Gump of real life. So then, seemingly on a whim, in 1871, he and two other guys decide to go up to Montana. Now, this is the height of the gold rush, so it wasn't totally random, but why he decided to go up to Montana is anybody's guess. So they floated up the Missouri River, and by the time they got to Montana, they had no more money. So they walked 150 miles to Helena, and he eventually settled in Deer Lodge. And it's in Deer Lodge that he's introduced to brewing. So this is Leopold. He's quite handsome. And when he's in Deer Lodge, he quickly becomes known for being a hard and reliable worker. So much so that in 1875, a Frenchman named Pierre Valentin, he also went by Peter, who owned the brewery in Deer Lodge, asked him to take over for a year when he went back to Europe to regain his health. Now, it's worth noting that at this time in the 19th century, basically every town in America had its own brewery because the Transcontinental Railroad hadn't crossed the entire country. They didn't have refrigerated rail cars. They didn't have pasteurization yet for beer. So every little town had its own beer. And it's here that he's introduced, when he's taking over this company for a year, into brewing. And when Pierre gets back, he sells his company to sorry, I'm having technical difficulties on my end. He sells his brewery to two miners who immediately fail. So Leopold opens up his Centennial Brewing Company in 1876 with another man. And at this point still, he's only had 1 year of experience. And it's in 1878, after a couple years of owning this brewery, that he goes back to Germany to a brewer's school, learns how to become a brewmaster. He meets and marries his wife, Joanna, brings her back to Montana, of all places. And in 1880, they have their first son, Peter G., in a log cabin in Butte. Because by now, Leopold has been one of the founding fathers of Butte. And he's still a carpenter at this time. He's built some of the first buildings, in Butte. And that's, as if that's not enough, he was a county commissioner for 7 years. He was on the Constitutional Convention to make Montana a state. He was a legislator eventually when it did become a state. And in 1895, he was part of the Capital Commission, which was just a little group of people who were traveling around Western capitals, looking at buildings, how they ran their government, because Helena wanted a new Capitol building. So that's what brings Leopold to our area. So this is what the old brewery property looked like in 1895. It was a tannery that began in 1859, and by the 1890s it wasn't running, but this is what it looked like. And Leopold's, we don't know how Leopold came across this property. There's a story, a rumor, a myth, with many iterations to it, that there was a barber in a hotel in Olympia shaving Leopold, who told him that there was perfect water for beer down here at these springs that Native Americans have been using for generations and thousands of years. I don't have enough time to talk about my theories on this. There's no concrete evidence that says this is true at all, but there's also nothing that says it didn't happen. So we don't know, we'll probably never know, but this is the property that Leopold eventually came across and that he purchased a month later. Yes, it's worth noting that this property was 5 acres with 2 good houses, according to Leopold, 30 horsepower of water power, and an orchard that he got for $4,500, which in 1895 is the equivalent of about $130,000, or as Leopold said in a letter, dirt cheap. So it's worth noting that sometimes this gets bungled in company history, but 2 months after he purchased this property, he had the water tested for brewing qualities. He sent it to a brewing lab in Chicago. That's what this letter is. Leopold immediately sells his home in Montana in 1895 in September. He moves to Portland because by now he's got 6 kids, and Olympia and Tumwater did not have a large enough house for his kids. So he bought a house in Portland, and it was his original intent to have a small brewery as a side project, which quickly became a very large project that he led full on. But originally, it was just a side project. So it was after he has this water tested that he divests all of his interest in Montana. He moves to Portland. They start tearing things down immediately. And by 1896, we have the Capitol Brewing Company. So here you can see the 2 houses there in the center. There's one on a little hill that his brother Louis lived in, because Louis was originally supposed to be the one taking care of the day-to-day, and Leopold would be down in Portland. And then the other one that you could see in the last picture with the tannery, with the 3 windows, they turned into an office. And then there's an ice factory and the original brew house. And you can see already that they have some wharf area, because even though it's 5 acres, it's really quite small down there. And the first beer rolls out in October of 1896 to rave reviews. I mean, Olympia had 2 breweries before Leopold came in, but when he was in town, there were none. So people were really jazzed about it. And for comparison, at the time, a barrel of beer sold for $3.25. And Leopold, knowing that his was of a superior quality, sold his for $8. And he sold 3,500 within 3 months. So people were pretty happy to have beer, so things haven't really changed all that much. And Leopold was, he was obviously a German immigrant, but he was really German in everything that he did. And he was religious about cleanliness. And so they scrubbed the brewery multiple times a day. And those of you that are familiar with the brewery know that that didn't change at all. The brewery was hospital clean all the time, and they used artesian well water to clean everything. And as you can see, his motto was quality first, quantity next. He was much more interested in having a good product than shipping out tons of it. But shipping out tons of it he did because it was so well received. Sales are increasing, and by just after a few years, by 1898, when the Klondike Gold Rush happens, Leopold's already shipping internationally, like to Hawaii, Russia, China, and then the Gold Rush hits, and he jumped on that bandwagon, and he's sending thousands of cases of beer to Alaska, and it's just skyrocketing exponentially, really. Even in 1898, if you are familiar with the house in our new print of the USS Olympia, the brewery sent barrels of beer to Admiral Dewey after their defeat in Manila Bay, and they defeated the Spanish in the Spanish-American War because they were on the USS Olympia. So that is Frank. Good call. So there's so much progress being made, so much sales, that a couple changes are made in 1902. First is the name change from the Capitol Brewing Company to the Olympia Brewing Company, because according to Leopold's, it made more sense geographically. The beer at this point, originally they called it, a capital like Pale Elixir and Pale Export, but people were calling it Olympia beer. So it made sense. And then Peter confirmed about 50 years later that locals called the beer Tumwater beer, but all their mail came addressed to Olympia Beer and the Olympia Brewing Company, so they decided to change the name. And then also in 1902 is we get the "It's the Water" slogan, which is a much better story. And it is coined by Frank Kenny, who became the secretary in 1901. And in 1902, he came up to Leopold and he said, "You know what? I've been thinking, and I think that we need a slogan that's short and unique, and it rouses questions, and we always talk about our water, so it should be, 'It's the water.'" And Leopold was like, that's great. Let's say the water makes it." And Frank said, "No, I think it should be, 'It's the water.' The shorter the better." And so he said, "Okay, great. It's in the water." And Frank said, "No, we need to do this." He stuck to his guns, and Leopold said, "Okay, well, let's sleep on it. We'll talk about it tomorrow." And they came back, volleyed back and forth the next day. They argued, and finally Leopold conceded. He said, "Okay, we'll go with it. We'll go with 'It's the water.'" And Frank Kenny later said, who, by the way, worked at the company for over 50 years, which is outstanding. He said later that Leopold was the kind of guy who would punch holes in an argument just to see if there was anything wrong with it. So I think that's what he was doing. He probably thought it was great the whole time. But I, for one, am thankful because, it put Tumwater on the map. So sales, skyrocket. And by 1905, we start to see what we are more familiar with. The brewery starts looking like what we recognize. And in 1906, the brick brew house is completed. As you can see, the Schmidt House, where we are sitting in a room that's not yet built, is already constructed. This photo, I believe, is from early 1907. You can see the brew house is already steaming, but they're not quite done with their railroad or a cellar behind the brew house. And the old wooden brew house, you can see, has been turned into a cellar. It's just back there painted. And at any given time, really, in this era, there's at least a dozen buildings down there. It was packed to the gills, full of machine shops, carpenter shops, boilers. It was a little city down there. And sales continue to increase exponentially up until 1914, when a couple terrible things happened. First, Leopold died. He had been ill for a while, but it was still unexpected. He died in a hotel in Bellingham, which was named after him, because he did not just own one brewery. He owned 5 breweries, he owned hotels, he owned quite a bit of stuff, and his friends had actually named Hotel Leopold after him in his honor, and he was there when he passed away. And a mere 6 weeks later, the voters of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho voted to go dry. So it was a pretty devastating year for the brewery, but Peter G. Schmidt, who is now president, was still pretty hopeful. And I'm not going to talk much about Prohibition. Somebody could write their own book on Prohibition. Needless to say, the company kept busy. The family, kept busy. They did a bunch of stuff, hotel-wise, transportation-wise. Like many breweries across the nation, they sort of altered what they were doing, and they had stakes in creamery, so they made ice cream, butter. They had an ice factory. And their most worthwhile enterprise was making fruit beverages. In 1915, when they knew Prohibition was coming, they retrofitted their brewery in Salem to try out a new beverage called Loju, which was loganberry juice. And it sold pretty well, and these are very similar to a juice soda type thing. And up here, we made apple juice, and they had a flat apple juice, so it was just an apple juice, and they had a sparkling apple juice, which was obviously more like sparkling cider. And it seemed pretty promising for a while, but sugar costs after World War I spiked, and after a series of mismanagements, that went under. They decided to end that. And so the brewery down below has not produced a beverage since 1921. And after that, Tumwater paper mill plant, they bought the property down there, and it took like 6 years for them to build and operate a paper mill, which only lasted for about a year. As you can imagine, people around here were not thrilled with the smell. But I guess, luckily, in a weird twist of fate, the Great Depression started, so it went under. But by the time it's clear that Prohibition is going to end, Peter knows that he can't use that building for a new brewery, that he's going to have to build something else, something bigger, something more modern, because like Don said, Peter was an engineer. He was, I don't like to give personality to the dead. I don't know if he was a genius, but he was very smart and very technical. So he and his brother Adolf, now I did mention there's 6 of them, and all of the brothers were involved in brewing in some capacity. 4 of them were certified brewmasters, and 1 was on the business side of things, and then they had a sister. And so Peter is here on the left, and his brother Adolf is in the middle of the middle photo. And in case you're curious, that is the first 1933 kettle, and that the top of that is the one that's on display at Tumwater City Hall. So they decide to build the brewery, but before they can open, they need some help raising the funds. So they put out in the Olympian a public offering for $1 a share, and pretty quickly they get the funds they need with a large investment by Emil Sick, who owns Rainier Brewing after Prohibition. So they build their brewery, and they are off and running. And I should note, too, so Prohibition is repealed in 1933, and the first beer rolls out in January 1934. And so the second half of this story is really one that you guys are probably more familiar with, and it's basically the overarching story here is that sales increase. That's it. They never stop increasing. It's just a story of growth. But like every company, and especially in the brewing industry, there's setbacks and adversity that they have to deal with. And the first one of those is the beer can. Canned beer is first introduced in 1935 in Virginia. But as you can imagine, the technology was not great. Now, Peter, being a forward-thinking dude, he built his brewery so it was adaptable to canning beer because he knew that was going to happen, but he didn't want to do it until the technology was there because you could taste the metal through the cans, which I mean, some people still complain about, but it was really bad back then. Like you could pasteurize it without the cans blowing up now, but it still tasted bad. So to counteract canned beer, Olympia designed the stubby bottle. And they first introduced the stubby in California in November of 1935, and then in the Northwest in December, excuse me. And then the first really big year of the stubby is 1936 when this ad is made. And as you can see, it's the right size for your fridge. It's shorter, it's cuter. It had thicker glass, so it wouldn't break as easy. It was easier to carry. It had 11 ounces, just like a can, so it was better. And there are still some breweries that have their own little stubbies and steinies, but it starts with us. And the next big problem for them, if you could call it a problem really, is World War II. And because they weren't canning beer, the metal shortage that happened didn't affect them as bad as it did other breweries. They still had the Schmidt family spearheaded a recycling campaign for scrap tin and scrap metal. They collected number 10 cans, which are the big coffee can size from hotels and restaurants and logging camps, and they would pop out and crimp their own bottle caps, and they would re-crimp bottle caps. And so this is a photo of women taking up the slack during World War II, re-crimping bottles, and if you came to our art show, you probably saw this on display. This ad on the right is touting their more economical bottle, their picnic size, because it's 32 ounces with just, one little cap. So even with World War II and the troubles they faced, they really came out okay. Most breweries, all breweries, because the brewing industry was deemed a morale booster for war, so they didn't have to convert their factories. They had to give over 15% of their product to the armed forces. So for smaller breweries, that really took a toll on their overall amount. So a lot of breweries start folding then, and Olympia, luckily, had purchased basically everything they needed material-wise before the war, sensing it was going to happen and just getting some really good prices. So material-wise, they didn't really face shortages. Most metal-wise, they didn't really face shortages. And so they turn out okay. And that continues. And I love this photo, mostly because I really like the design on the facade, which is no longer there, but that building's just right across the street. But because Olympia was very fervent in its belief that it was a light beer of temperate enjoyment. And when people see that, a lot of times they think that's an oxymoron and that it's hilarious. But really, going back to Leopold, and I think for almost all German brewers, it's not about some funny oxymoron. It's that they believed in drinking in moderation and just enjoying the beer. And Olympia also called itself a light table beer, and that's obviously before light beer as we know it. And it had nothing to do with calories or color or taste even, just that it was refreshing and should be enjoyed responsibly. And even in 1948-49, Peter was putting spots on the radio trying to get rid of all drunk driving accidents on the freeway. He was, this has always been a problem, but he was pretty dedicated to having 0 traffic deaths because of drinking. But still, one issue that they faced from the 30s all the way through the 60s was people who wanted to repeal drinking alcohol, or at least having it advertised. So the dries were always an issue for breweries, and they were always kept on the alert. But overall, they just wanted people to enjoy their light beverage of moderation. So the 50s and the 60s I think we're getting into some eras that you guys probably have heard about and remember, and it was just a period of exponential growth, especially the 60s. They grew so quickly that they couldn't wait for metal tanks to be built. They had to build wooden ones. And I should note that Olympia was the first brewery to use all stainless steel kegs in the 40s. But even then, they're advanced technologically always, but they're growing so fast that they have to revert to wood. As you can see at this point too, they're starting to expand southward into the valley, and it's just, on the rise. But booming business isn't usually terrible. So consolidation, though, was starting to become a problem. This is, the 70s, and this Olympia alone, this is their biggest year of brewing 4 million barrels in the 70s before they acquire more brands. But it's worth noting and really important to remember that consolidation of the brewing industry really starts here. After World War II, larger corporations are buying up smaller breweries because they just have a bigger distribution network. And in the 1950s with TV, they have larger advertising budgets, and it just is cyclic. They have huge advertising budgets, and then they have TV, and then they sell more beer, and it just grows and grows and grows. And so smaller breweries are receding like nobody's business. As to put it in perspective, before Prohibition, there was about 4,000 breweries in the country, and at this point, we're probably down to less than 100 breweries. Now we're at over 5,000, but it's different. Because of consolidation, though, Olympia's starting to compete, and they're trying to compete. So in 1974, they acquired the Theodore Hams Brewing Company out of St. Paul, Minnesota. And in 1977, they acquired Lone Star Beer out of San Antonio. And so at this point, they're also brewing all of the other labels that these companies have. And their capacity to brew was about 9 million barrels a year. And the most they ever brewed was about 7 million. And because of that, they became the 6th largest brewery in the country. But for comparison, Budweiser, who, Anheuser-Busch at the time was the top brewery in the nation, and they were brewing about 37 million. So even then, just like now, even though Olympia's in the top 10, they are not anywhere near the top, 3 or 4. But even so, this is the height of Olympia. This is, it's great. It's a major tourist attraction to the area. And those wooden tanks, repurposed for the tasting room. So in 1962, just as an example, the World's Fair brought in over 250,000 visitors to the brewery. And every year there was about 100,000 visitors to the brewery. It was the reason people came to Tumwater. No offense, people from Tumwater. It was the reason people came to Tumwater. And at this time, too, if you can see, I don't know if you can all the way in the back, but there's 4 different beers there. You have regular Olympia, you have Olympia Golds, which is their light beer, you have Olympia Dark, and Olympia Dry. And besides regular people, the brewery was doing so well at this time. It's been said that they had so much money they didn't know what to do with it. So when they had their annual meetings and whatnot, they would hire celebrities, they would hire big Hollywood names to entertain, and we had a lot of people stop by anyway, like Bob Hope, Jerry Lewis had a tour, and other celebrities, and now you have sponsorships of major sporting events. They sponsored the LA Dodgers, Evel Knievel, the big names, the hydroplanes. And what I would love to talk more about, but unfortunately we don't really have much of, is Olympia in pop culture. Because we have the corporate records, we don't really keep much of what other people were doing. The internet has a pretty good trove of stuff of what movies Olympia is in, but we don't have that much stuff. But I do love this picture of Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And these distributor vans in Montana are pretty great too. And like I said, I could go on and on and on about all the things people did around here in high school, what college students did, just all these things that people did with Olympia. I think I've recently discovered that people made hats with the cans. Yeah, you guys know. But what we do have, luckily, are some digitized commercials. And I'm going to play for you my most favorite Olympia commercial from 1973, featuring employees of the brewery. Everybody that's in it worked at the brewery, and if you look closely, you'll be able to see the stained glass that's now at 3 Magnets downtown. So without further ado.
Ole, ole, ole. Ole, ole, ole. Ole, ole, ole. Ole, ole, ole. It's the water, that makes it ole beer. It's the water and a lot more.
It's the special care that makes Olympia such a special beer. That's Olympia. It's the way we age our Ole beer. It's the water and a lot. It's the house and grain, the best that we can buy. It's the extra time. That's just one reason why. The time to make it great, to make Olympia. It's the water and a lot more.
Well, I hope everybody has that stuck in their head for 3 days. Because I've been whistling it all morning. But unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. And what the public, I wasn't alive, but I don't think was aware of, that even though Olympia seemed to be unstoppable at this time, the writing had been on the wall for quite a while, because during the 1970s, sales were stagnant the whole time. Now, Olympia never lost money. They never were in the red. But it was stagnant, and by the early 80s, consolidation was just going full bore, and Pabst started buying up shares. And so instead of allowing a hostile takeover, the Schmidts negotiated a merger. And this headline is from 1982, but that didn't end until 1983, when most people know that's when Pabst took over. And the next couple decades are not the same, but business as usual. They're contract brewing for a lot of different brands. I think that's what we're most familiar with. So we all know that now this is the breweries are in kind of a sad state of repair, and the last whistle blew for the new brewery, the new old brewery, in 2003. And this, the photo on the left was taken just a couple weeks before the temporary roofs were put on the old brew house and before the windows were closed up. But that's essentially what it looks like today. And it's anybody's guess what's happening with that one. It's crumbling, unfortunately, but maybe someday we can do something with it. But that is a brief history of the Olympia Brewing Company. So thank you. And I would be happy to answer anyone's questions or entertain a story. Yes.
When Pabst took over, were they allowed to use the artesian well water?
That's Paul. I'm going to refer some of my questions to our expert brewmaster. The question was, when Pabst took over, were they allowed to use the artesian water? Yes. Yes. Yeah.
When Olympia started brewing for Lone Star and some of the others in their earlier days, did they use the recipes from those breweries, or was it really Olympia beer in a different vessel?
Okay, I know the answer to that one. They started out all the same, and it was internally known as hop beer, Hams Ole Pabst. And then towards the end, which the technical details of that I don't know, they were mixed, carbonated differently. I don't know. They were packaged differently, so they tasted like their respective beers, even though their respective beers all taste very similar. But they all started the exact same, and then tweaks were made towards the end to be Lone Star, Pabst, Ole. Yeah.
Just a little anecdote. In 1974, I was a college student at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, long way from here. But the word, it was known as a party school, but Olympia beer is coming, and the student population went berserk. They sold it all out of. It didn't even go to the liquor store. They just sold it right out of the back of the truck until the 18-wheeler was empty. You know, that was it was a mania for a little while there.
That's awesome. Yeah, at the height, when they were the sixth largest, they sold in 26 states. And some of that was just Pabst, and some of it was just Hams, and some was just Lone Star, but most of it was overlapped. So there were some states on the East Coast that sold it, but they were dominant on the West Coast and are making a resurgence. Yes.
Megan, has Karen Johnson shared with you the story about the college students in Oregon and the cannon?
Yes. Dennis, would you like to tell us the story? Go ahead. Well, I don't know. I do remember. I mean, I've heard it. You probably do it more justice.
Okay. Very briefly, there were some college students in Oregon that were engineers, and they needed to design a project for class. They decided to build a cannon. And of course, they had to test the cannon, and they needed some ammunition. They used Ole beer cans. And the Olympia Beer Company found out about this apparently and sent a truckload down to these guys.
They're nothing if not giving. Yeah.
No, it went full, I think.
Are the original beer recipes still being used anywhere?
Well, absolutely not, because Olympia is now brewed in California, so the water is out of it. Just right off the bat. We do have the original recipe, thanks to Paul, but I don't think that's what they're using. And now, I should tell you guys that the brewing industry is convoluted, especially because of mergers. So today, Pabst owns the Olympia brand, and it is contract brewed by Miller, all out of California, but it's massively confusing to try to track who owns what and who brews what.
So they also own the recipes then?
They would own the recipe.
Yes, even though we have some different ones. Yes, Karen.
This is a follow-up to Dennis's story about cannon. The beer cans were first empty. We are talking about male college students.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do believe that they were invited out to somewhere down in the valley to shoot it off, too.
They brought the cannon up here at the request of the brewery.
They were fun guys. Anybody else? Yeah.
I've heard rumor, but how much longer will the Olympia brand of beer be produced?
Indefinitely, I would assume. I know that Pabst has some big plans for it, so it's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Oh, it is, right down my throat.
That's your husband.
Any other stories or questions for?
Yeah.
Baskin
What has become of the artisans?
I do have to say that was also before I was born. I am familiar with the commercials. I wish I had a bumper sticker that says, I'm with the artisans, but I couldn't tell you. They're around somewhere, I guess, protecting the properties.
Is there a copyright on them, or, does somebody own that idea?
If they did, it would be Pabst, and they haven't rehashed that yet. Maybe they will.
So maybe I should just add, I'm Pete Komet, the mayor of Tumwater. So the three cities, Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater, have purchased the water rights from the brewery. We own the wells and the right to use the water, and we're in the process of trying to bring those wells back into production. They are developed in the same aquifer that the current city wells that are in the nearby are from. So if you're drinking Tumwater water, you're essentially drinking more or less the same water that was used to brew Olympia beer. But,
You're all made out of magic too.
yeah.
We are all artisans.
Well, I haven't been there yet, but there's a new brew pub in downtown Olympia called Well Number Something.
80. It opens on Monday.
Okay. They use artesian water that's in the back of the building to brew their beer, and then apparently they're going to have a large Olympia Brewery billboard.
They do already. They have some fantastic artwork in there.
That'll be worth checking out, as well as the stained glass one down in Three Bag.
Yes, there are multiple restaurants in town that decorate with Olympia stuff, but Well 80 does have a full-size billboard down on one of their walls that's pretty fantastic. Yeah.
Heard about the artisans, can you explain a little?
Oh, yeah, sure. The Artisans was an ad campaign in the 80s, a series of commercials about these mystical artisans who were, I think, playing pranks on people or something. They're like leprechauns, but our version of it.
That's right. Any other last questions?
When's your book been?
In the future. It's slow going. It's a lot easier to write when there are deadlines and graduations involved. But it's coming along. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Before you leave, also, we have a little display case over in the dining room over by Lee Weiner there. There's some old bottles, old Olympia bottles and different cans and different things, so you might want to take a peek at that before you leave. Also, we have a change in our published schedule for our history talks. In 2 weeks, it was going to be Drew Crooks, but because of illness, we've had to put him back to next season. And so we are going to have a very good replacement here, Northwest Carriage Museum out of Raymond, an amazing museum, and both that's a husband-wife team, curator and director, are going to be here on April 5th, so you're going to want to come back for that, and I hope you stay and visit with Megan a little bit before you leave, but thank you for coming so much and supporting this History Talk program of the Olympia Tumwater Foundation. Thank you so much.